used to think the scariest sound in the world was silence, the kind that fills a room right before something breaks. But that was before I heard a doctor say the words urgent surgery, vascular defect, and $140,000 in the same breath, while my daughter's tiny hand barely clung to mine under the dim, sterile glow of a heart monitor. Now I know better. Silence isn't the scariest sound. The scariest sound is your child asking if she's going to die and realizing you can't afford the answer. The machines beeped in slow, steady rhythm beside her, blinking in soft greens and occasional reds, like Christmas lights gone cold. I hated them for how calm they sounded. As if they weren't measuring the disintegration of everything I knew. As if they weren't tracking the slow unraveling of my daughter's life. Maya was barely 5 years old. Her body lay too still beneath layers of blankets far too large for her frame. Her cheeks, usually a warm honey, looked like pale porcelain under the harsh hospital fluorescence. Her lips were chapped, her breaths shallow, and every so often, she twitched in her sleep, not like a dream, but like her body didn't quite know how to stay whole anymore. The vascular surgeon, Dr. Bernard, a kind man with sad eyes and sleeves rolled past his elbows, had delivered the news with the grace of someone who had clearly done this before. He had a folder in his hands that he didn't bother to open. I think he knew once you said the word rare, everything after that just became noise. We've diagnosed her with arteriovenous malformation, specifically located in a cluster behind her left lung. It's congenital but aggressive. We believe it's what's been causing her persistent symptoms: fatigue, breathlessness, the recent collapse. He paused for a breath, then glanced down at Maya before continuing. Surgery is necessary, and it needs to happen soon. There's a narrow window before complications increase exponentially. That's when he said the number. $140,000. That was the cost of her life, written out in neat black ink on hospital stationery, underlined by urgency and followed by payment options that didn't include magic or miracles. Thomas was standing beside me, silent, holding my other hand, fingers interlocked in that familiar way that reminded me we were still us, even as the world around us cracked at the edges. "I'll find a way," he whispered. His voice was raw. "We'll find a way. We have to." But when I called my parents, hoping for the kind of rescue that parents are supposed to provide without hesitation, I was met with a voice so clinical it made Dr. Bernard sound like a romantic poet. "I'm sorry to hear that," my father said, his tone as dry as kindling. "But we need to be prudent with our finances, especially at our age." Prudent. I stared at the window in front of me, watching snow fall outside the hospital room like confetti from a party we were never invited to. My mother's voice followed a second later. "Have you explored loans, sweetheart? Maybe a fundraiser of some kind? Sometimes the community is more helpful than family in these things." I didn't know whether to laugh or scream. They were sitting on a paid-off house in Newton, a vacation condo in Sarasota, and a stock portfolio I'd helped them diversify during my second pregnancy. My mother still went to weekly facials and spent $300 on French linen candles like they were prescriptions. "But she's your granddaughter," I said quietly. There was silence. A beat. Then the final blow. "We've always believed children should be raised to be self-reliant." That conversation ended with the same quiet I'd feared when I first entered Maya's room. I told Thomas later, curled up on the tiny plastic couch in the waiting room while Maya underwent another round of scans. They said no. He didn't ask why. He didn't ask what excuses they gave. He just exhaled slowly and pulled me close, pressing his lips against my temple like he could whisper all his strength into my bones. We sat like that for a long time, long after visiting hours had ended, long after the night nurse walked by and pretended not to see us. 2 weeks passed. Maya's condition stabilized, but only because she was pumped with so many medications that her liver was starting to show signs of strain. The surgery window was closing. Her body wasn't going to wait for our financial situation to catch up. And then, like a slap in the face made of velvet and glitter, I received a family-wide email from my mother titled "Exciting News." Attached to it was a PDF flyer, complete with gold script and swirly fonts, announcing the upcoming wedding of my younger brother, Ethan. Apparently, he had proposed to his girlfriend at a vineyard in Portugal, and they had decided, naturally, to have their wedding at a castle in Italy. Lake Como. June. There was even a line about the budget. Estimated total investment, $250,000 and worth every euro. I dropped my phone. Not because it slipped. Not because I was shocked. But because something inside me had physically recoiled, like my body knew my mind wouldn't be able to carry what I'd just seen. They wouldn't help save my daughter. But they would spend $250,000 on imported floral arches, private chefs, and a string quartet flown in from Vienna to play during cocktail hour. Thomas came in minutes later. He found me sitting on the floor of the hospital's family bathroom, hands shaking, the phone on the tile beside me, and Maya's medical paperwork spread out in my lap. I showed him the email. He read it once, then twice. And then he did something I will never forget as long as I live. He laughed. It wasn't loud. It wasn't joyful. It was the kind of laugh that sounds like the last flicker of a match in the middle of a forest fire. They always said Ethan was the favorite, he muttered. I just didn't think they'd make it this obvious. I should have cried. I should have screamed. But instead, I reached down and picked up the folder again. My hand steadied. I had no more room for grief. Only action. That night, after Maya had fallen asleep to the humming of lullaby melodies from her bedside monitor, we sat in the hospital cafeteria, staring at styrofoam cups of coffee that tasted like regret. We'll sell the car, I said. Thomas shook his head. That might get us 10 grand. We'd need to sell both, and even then we'd be short. I'll cash out my 401k. You'd get penalized. I don't care. We started a GoFundMe. We sent out letters to every grant program we could find. We applied for medical hardship discounts, begged for sliding scales, reached out to churches and nonprofits and strangers who might care more about Maya than her own grandparents did. And still we were over $60,000 short. It was Evelyn who called first. Can you both come by the house tomorrow? She asked, her voice trembling just slightly. We'd like to see you. Please bring Maya's most recent paperwork if you can. Thomas looked puzzled when I told him. His parents were sweet. Kind. The type of people who made chicken soup when they heard you sneezed once on the phone. But they weren't rich. James had been a school janitor until arthritis took over his knees. Evelyn worked in a bakery part-time and refused to retire because she said the smell of cinnamon rolls gave her joy. We didn't expect anything from them. Honestly, we had just hoped they might be able to share the fundraiser a few more times with their church friends. Their home was warm. The wallpaper had yellowed from the sun, and the armchairs had been reupholstered so many times they didn't even match anymore. But it smelled like vanilla and home, and for the first time in weeks I felt like I could breathe again. James had laid out the folder on the table. Evelyn brought out tea. There were cookies. Always cookies. And then James cleared his throat. We've been talking, he began, not looking up. About what matters. About what's temporary. And about what's not. I saw the legal papers before I understood what they were. A contract of sale. Deed transfer. Realtor signatures. You sold the house? Thomas said, stunned. James nodded once. We had offers over asking. People are desperate for property these days. But this is your home. You've lived here for 30 years. Evelyn reached across the table and covered my hand with hers. Her skin was soft and trembling, but her voice was firm. Walls can be rebuilt. Roofs can be replaced. But there is no remodeling the loss of a child. She placed a check on the table. It was made out to the hospital. For $140,000. Not a cent less. We've already signed over the funds, she said. They'll hold it in escrow until the procedure is scheduled. I couldn't speak. I just cried. Not the quiet, single tear kind you see in movies, but the kind that comes from every corner of your soul, grief, relief, gratitude, all colliding in one messy, beautiful breakdown. Maya had no idea what any of it meant. But when I held her hand the next morning, she looked up at me and smiled, sleepy and soft. Mommy, she whispered, I dreamed about the stars last night. They were coming back. I smiled through the tears. Yes, baby. They're coming back. They told me the surgery would last 4 hours, but by the time the hands on the clock made their slow rotation across the sterile walls, I realized time is a cruel companion when your child is under anesthesia. I paced the cold hospital corridor outside the surgical suite like a ghost trying to haunt her way into the operating room, desperate to keep her from slipping into that unknowable place between breath and stillness. Thomas sat quietly on the bench nearby, elbows resting on his knees, his head bowed and hands clasped together, not in prayer, but in that exhausted kind of stillness that happens when hope is the only thing holding your body upright. His parents sat across from us, Evelyn clutching a worn handkerchief in one hand, and James with both hands folded in his lap, their fingers brushing but not quite touching. They'd aged 10 years in the past 10 days, though they never once wavered. Not when they signed the deed over to the buyer. Not when they packed the last of their belongings into a storage unit. And certainly not now while their only granddaughter fought for her life a few doors away. The doors to the ER finally opened just after hour 5, and I stood before the surgeon even spoke, breath caught in my throat like a scream that couldn't find its voice. Dr. Bernard pulled down his mask slowly, his eyes tired, but not grim. That's how I knew before he even said the words. She's going to be okay. I don't remember collapsing into Thomas's arms, but I remember the feel of his sweater against my cheek and the scent of his skin, warm, familiar, like home, and I remember Evelyn saying something. But the words were drowned in the rush of blood in my ears in the sudden, overwhelming release of breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. We were going to keep her. The recovery was slow and full of tender, cautious moments. Maya spent 2 weeks in pediatric ICU, her body adjusting to its newly rewired vessels, her breaths no longer shallow and desperate but deep and full, like the way she used to breathe when she was curled against my chest as an infant. Safe in a world that had not yet betrayed her. I read to her every day, old picture books that she knew by heart and newer ones she could barely keep her eyes open to follow. Thomas brought in a small music player and Evelyn crocheted soft animal toys with trembling fingers while James made paper cranes and hung them from her four-pole with fishing wire and prayer. I remember one afternoon when the late winter sun spilled through the hospital window and turned the edges of Maya's blanket to gold. She looked up at me and whispered, "Mommy, I don't feel like I'm disappearing anymore." And I just nodded, too full of feeling to say anything back, brushing a stray curl from her forehead and kissing the place where her surgical scar would one day fade into memory. After she was discharged, we moved into Evelyn and James's one-bedroom rental for a few weeks, an old place near a railway station with creaky floors and water that ran too hot, too quickly. But it was filled with warmth and gentleness, and in the evenings, the scent of cinnamon and ginger would wrap around us like a blanket, rising from the oven where Evelyn still insisted on baking even when her hands ached. We made do, and more than that, we were at peace. There was no grand announcement from my parents. No apology. Not even a phone call asking how Maya had fared. But there was a forwarded email from my mother that arrived one afternoon just as I was folding Maya's pajamas into the old dresser Evelyn had emptied for us. The subject line read, "Countdown to Como." Inside were hotel confirmations, a seating chart for the rehearsal dinner, and a link to the private yacht company that would ferry guests across Lake Como for the welcome gala. I didn't even blink. I just stared at the email and let it wash over me like brackish water, ugly, heavy, and impossible to scrub from the corners of your skin. The wedding was scheduled for June. It was spring now, but the invitations had already been sent out, and I'd heard from a friend of a friend that my parents had commissioned a designer to craft bespoke save-the-dates etched into polished glass tiles, each one placed in a velvet box with imported truffle confections. I wasn't invited. Neither was Thomas. Or Maya. But that wasn't a surprise. It was a declaration. They'd chosen. I saw the photos online before the wedding even ended. The media coverage was immediate. Lifestyle blogs, social pages, fashion magazines hungry for glossy extravagance. Ethan's fiancée, Lillian, had landed a small influencer sponsorship deal through one of her makeup brands, and she'd arranged for a content team to shoot the event as if it were a royal coronation. And in many ways it was. My brother stood on the balcony of a 5-star villa in a white tuxedo, looking out over the lake as fireworks exploded in a synchronized pattern above him. Guests lounged on white cushions by the infinity pool, sipping lavender cocktails crafted by an emotion mixologist, whatever that was. There were imported orchids cascading from golden arches, a harpist playing ambient renditions of 90s pop songs, and a 3-tiered cake flown in from Paris on a private jet. 3 layers. 3 layers that cost, by some estimates, over $10,000. And I couldn't stop thinking about Maya's first hospital bill, itemized and merciless, and how I had cried over a single antibiotic that had cost $1,400 out of pocket. I watched the video of Ethan and Lillian's vows late that night, after Maya had finally fallen asleep in our borrowed bedroom, her hand curled around the plush sloth Evelyn had made for her during recovery. I should have turned it off. I should have deleted the email and gone to bed. But I didn't. I watched them laugh under a canopy of silk and gold, watched my parents smile like the world was perfect, watched my mother dab at her eyes with a diamond-studded handkerchief, and my father raise a glass of 40-year-old scotch to toast. A love that triumphs above all else. And I sat there in the dark, the laptop screen casting blue light across my face, while something in my chest went very still. Not empty. Not hollow. But focused. Cold and quiet like steel pulled from flame. That was the moment. That was the moment I said it aloud and to myself. Not in rage. Not in desperation. But in absolute clarity. They chose luxury over life, I said, my voice barely more than a breath, but filled with iron. I will make sure they regret it. They thought I would disappear. They thought I would fade into gratitude and quiet poverty, content to be the mother who was saved by the kindness of others. But they didn't understand that I wasn't asking for revenge. I wasn't even asking for justice. I was making a promise. Not to them. Not to Thomas. Not even to Maya. I made it to myself. Because some betrayals are so precise, so deeply calculated, that they carve a new space inside you, one you never asked for, but one you grow into like new skin. The following week, I started sketching out a plan. I had a degree in finance. I had spent years in data analysis before Maya was born. And while motherhood had shifted my priorities, it hadn't dulled my intellect. If anything, the last few months had sharpened me into something more exacting. I didn't tell Thomas at first. Not because I wanted to keep secrets, but because I knew the heaviness of what I was carrying needed to be mine until I could shape it into something I could offer him with pride. I began researching my parents' business holdings. I pulled records, traced investments, cross-referenced charity filings that had once looked generous but now glimmered with convenient omissions. I reviewed the foundation paperwork my father had used to shelter most of his liquid wealth and discovered loopholes, a few sloppily hidden, others cleverly disguised beneath layers of outdated tax shelters and vanity real estate projects. But I didn't need to destroy him. I only needed to reveal him. To show the world the truth of a man who once told me in the same breath that he couldn't afford to save his granddaughter, and then spent more on a wedding gown than it would have cost to give Maya another 10 years. The silence around my plan wasn't born of cowardice. It was born of strategy. Because I knew the first step in toppling a facade was letting everyone believe you had forgiven it. And so I sent an email. A simple one. Subject, congratulations. Inside, a single line. Wishing you and Lillian all the best in your new life together. Maya sends her love. I watched the read receipt pop up 4 minutes later. No reply. But that was fine. The next part didn't require conversation. It only required timing. And I had learned how to wait. I have always believed that truth, when wielded with patience, can cut deeper than vengeance ever could with a scream. And so I didn't rush. I didn't flinch. I didn't let my grief or rage drive me toward some flashy explosion of retribution. I let time do what it does best when guided by someone who has nothing left to lose and everything left to protect. The day I created the first account, I was sitting at the tiny kitchen table in the apartment above the antique shop where Evelyn and James were temporarily staying. Maya had just fallen asleep with her stuffed sloth tucked under one arm, and Thomas had gone out to pick up groceries before the snow thickened again. The light outside was soft and gray, folding over the window pane like worn wool. I logged in, typed slowly, carefully, choosing every word with the same precision I used to reserve for risk assessments and audit reports. I created the account using a name no one would recognize, an image of a blank shoreline as the profile photo, and a simple bio, for those who wonder what's hidden beneath the surface. Then I uploaded the first post. It was a photo taken from the public wedding album on Lillian's influencer page. Ethan and Lillian standing under a floral arch at the edge of Lake Como, her veil caught in the wind, his cufflinks catching the gold of the sunset. The caption I wrote beneath it was simple, quiet, devastating. This wedding cost $250,000. Their granddaughter's life-saving surgery would have cost just over half of that. They chose this. I didn't include names. I didn't include dates. But I didn't need to. I knew the people who followed those lifestyle blogs, who worshipped curated elegance and imported glamour, would recognize the villa. I knew the brands that had sponsored the gown and the venue and the wedding planner would take notice. Because appearances matter to people like my parents. Appearances are currency. And I had just stolen the first bill from their glittering stack. The post didn't go viral overnight. That would have been too easy, too messy. What it did was start a trickle. A slow, steady erosion. I followed it with another post, this time showing an article about the philanthropic legacy of my parents' foundation. The photo showed my mother smiling at a gala, shaking hands with a board member from a children's hospital. In the caption beneath I wrote, "This woman turned down her daughter's request for help paying for life-saving surgery. Then she donated $30,000 to secure a naming plaque for a wine lounge in a children's hospital she has never stepped foot in." Every claim I made was backed by a paper trail. Every donation had a timestamp. Every quote came from public sources. I didn't lie. I didn't embellish. I didn't need to. People can tolerate cruelty in whispers. But once it's placed beneath a spotlight, they flinch. They recoil. They question. And the questions started showing up in the comments. How could anyone do that to their own family? Is this real? I think I know which family this is. Check the Lake Como wedding hashtag. I was at that wedding. I had no idea. Thomas noticed first about 3 weeks in. He didn't ask outright, but I could see the recognition flicker in his eyes as he scrolled through his phone at night, frowning slightly, then glancing at me across the room. When he finally asked, his voice was soft but certain. You started that page, didn't you? I didn't deny it. I just nodded and waited. And in that moment, I knew there was still a part of me bracing for him to tell me to stop, to tell me it wasn't worth it, that I was better than this. But he didn't. He just reached across the table and took my hand in his. They deserve every word, he said. But more than that, Maya deserves the truth to live somewhere permanent. I hadn't known how much I needed his blessing until I had it. The posts became more frequent, and each one was quiet, measured, unapologetic. I never used our names. I never said my parents. I said they. I said the family. I said those who value prestige over people. But I included just enough detail for those paying attention. And plenty of people were. Sponsors began pulling back. A charity event got postponed. A networking gala was mysteriously rescheduled after a few subtle inquiries were made about one of its keynote speakers. And slowly, but unmistakably, my parents' social circle began to shrink. Their names were no longer spoken with admiration in those fragile social halls where wealth dances with pretense. Instead, they were whispered with uncertainty, with caution. Like names you only speak when you're sure the person isn't within earshot. And then came the invitation. The Montrose House Family Forum. A celebration of generational legacy. It was a pretentious title for what amounted to a live-streamed panel of wealthy families gathering at an estate outside of Cambridge to discuss the art of building and preserving generational success. My father was slated to speak. My mother was co-hosting. Ethan and Lillian were invited as the future generation. They were going to sit on a white couch in front of floral arrangements and talk about legacy, about values, about what it means to raise a strong family in modern America. And I was invited too. The invitation came in the mail, a mistake, I assumed, or perhaps a last-minute olive branch from my mother, who still clung to appearances like ivy clings to dying brick. I didn't RSVP, but I made plans to attend anyway. The day of the event, I wore a gray blouse and black trousers, simple and clean, my hair tied back in a low knot. Nothing dramatic. Nothing theatrical. I didn't want attention. I wanted clarity. The venue was opulent in a restrained way. Stone fountains, manicured gardens, white tents stretched across gravel walkways like sails. Inside the main hall, cameras were already rolling, focused on the velvet chairs arranged in a perfect arc for the panel. My mother stood near the edge of the stage, speaking to an event coordinator with the calm, poised tone she always used when trying to appear in control. My father adjusted his tie in the reflection of a gilded mirror, his expression hard and unreadable. I took my seat in the third row unnoticed. The event began with polite laughter, rehearsed anecdotes, and generational platitudes that made my stomach twist with a kind of quiet fury I had learned to tame. Ethan spoke first, all charm and polish, regaling the audience with stories of his entrepreneurial spirit and his commitment to carrying the family name forward with grace. Lillian followed, speaking of branding and social impact, her voice dipped in sugar and self-assurance. And then it was my parents' turn. They spoke of sacrifice, of hard choices, of doing what's best for the family, even when it's difficult. And as my mother smiled into the camera, saying, "We've always believed that real love is about building a legacy, not just for your children, but for their children," something inside me clicked. A quiet switch. A door opening. I stood. The room didn't notice me at first. My voice was calm, quiet, but it carried. "Do you mean the kind of legacy where you choose a wedding over a life?" The moderator paused, uncertain. The audience turned slowly, like a wave pulled by gravity. My parents froze. I stepped forward. "You speak about values. about sacrifice, about raising strong children. But when your granddaughter needed surgery, when she was lying in a hospital bed, slipping away, you chose silence. You chose luxury. You chose image over blood. The room was silent now. Not a breath. And when you refused to help, do you remember what you told me, Mother? I turned to her, keeping my voice steady. You said the community is often more helpful than family in these things. You were right. But I made sure the community knew the truth. My father's jaw clenched. My mother's hands fluttered in her lap like startled birds. It was me, I said, lifting my chin. I'm the one who started the page. I'm the one who told the world what you did. And I would do it again. The moderator stood, flustered, trying to regain control. Perhaps we should take this discussion offline. No, I said. Let them finish their performance. They've always been good at pretending. And with that I walked out. I didn't need applause. I didn't need a camera turned toward me. I just needed the truth to stand in the air like smoke no one could deny. Later, I sat in the quiet of the car with Thomas and Maya in the back seat, watching the sun dip below the horizon, turning the world a deep, bruised orange. He reached over and squeezed my hand. Maya was humming softly, half asleep. I exhaled. Sometimes destruction doesn't arrive as a bang or a blaze. Sometimes it comes softly, quiet as dusk, steady as erosion, silent as the moment a room empties of trust. That's how it began for my parents. Not with a scandal. Not with a headline. But with slow withdrawals of loyalty, of friendship, of funds. The night after the Montrose Forum, I didn't check the internet. I didn't need to. I'd said what I needed to say in front of the right people at the right time with the right words. Truth doesn't need to shout. It simply needs to be heard once by the right ears, and it starts to echo all on its own. When I woke the next morning to sunlight spilling across Maya's blanket and Thomas softly humming while frying eggs in the kitchen, I felt no rush to look at the fallout. I sipped my tea slowly. I kissed my daughter's forehead. I folded the same clothes I'd folded 100 times. And when I finally opened my laptop, I was greeted by the first ripple. A headline on a financial blog, discreet but firm. Montrose panel marred by family feud, questions raised about Mayfair legacy. Just beneath it, a paragraph quoting my exact words. Not twisted. Not misrepresented. Just echoed. Then another site. Then 3 more. Then a tweet. Then a thread. Then a video. The machine had started. I no longer needed to turn its crank. All I had to do now was live. In the following weeks, the unraveling became visible, not just online, but in the places that mattered to my parents most. Invitations began disappearing. Lillian's sponsored partnerships dropped to silence. Her polished photos met with comments that were no longer admiring but curious, even angry. My father's charity board position was quietly reevaluated, and his business partner of 15 years, a man who once toasted my father's foresight at every company dinner, publicly announced a pause in all shared ventures, pending a reassessment of moral alignment. They didn't lose everything at once. It happened slowly, and that was the cruelty of it. The more they tried to pretend nothing had changed, the more obvious it became that everything had. One day, I heard from an old colleague, someone I hadn't spoken to in years, who had attended the Montrose Forum. She looked like she was trying not to shatter, she said, referring to my mother. Your words, it was like they finally hit a wall she'd spent years pretending wasn't there. I said nothing in reply. Not because I had nothing to say, but because sometimes silence holds more justice than any argument ever could. I heard, through quiet channels, that the buyer pulled out of one of my father's most ambitious real estate projects, one he had been banking on for almost a decade. And without that income stream, the accounts began draining faster than they could refill. Luxury has a heavy upkeep. Homes require taxes. Staff require salaries. Vanity businesses lose money the moment their illusion fades. Within 2 months, they sold the Sarasota condo. Another month passed, and my mother auctioned off her jewelry, first the pieces she didn't wear often, then the heirloom diamond brooch that once belonged to my grandmother, the same one she told me I would never be responsible enough to keep. I didn't gloat. I didn't celebrate. Because some losses aren't victories. They're just facts. While they unraveled, we rebuilt. James and Evelyn's tiny rental began to feel like more than a temporary stop. It felt like a home layered in love, not linens. Maya grew stronger every day, her laughter slowly returning, her energy bubbling in short bursts until she could finally run from room to room without gasping for breath. There were days I'd sit at the table, watching her draw with colored pencils, her curls falling into her eyes, and I would suddenly feel my chest tighten with gratitude so deep it hurt. Not because she had survived, but because I had. Because we had. Thomas planted herbs in the small garden behind the house. Evelyn started teaching Maya how to make butter cookies with just the right crackle of sugar on top. James sang old folk songs while washing dishes, and sometimes, just sometimes, I caught Thomas standing by the doorway, watching us with tears quietly pooling in his eyes. One afternoon, when the breeze smelled like cut grass and cinnamon, Evelyn took my hand and said softly, "You gave us more than a granddaughter, sweetheart. You gave us purpose again." I had no words for that. So I just held her hand and let the moment speak for both of us. The town fair arrived in early summer, and we went together, all 5 of us, holding hands, sharing cotton candy, laughing too loudly at corny magic tricks. It wasn't extravagant. It wasn't elegant. But it was real. We took photos on a disposable camera. I didn't post them anywhere. I kept them for us because not every joy has to be shared to be sacred. That night, after Maya had fallen asleep with candy still stuck to the corners of her mouth, Thomas and I stood outside beneath the stars, his arm wrapped around me, his breath slow and warm against my temple. "You did it," he said quietly. "You saved her. You saved all of us." And I leaned my head against his chest and whispered, "No. They did. James. Evelyn. They showed us what love really looks like." We stayed there until the sky turned dark purple and the stars blinked gently overhead like reminders of every quiet miracle we'd survived. I didn't hear from my parents until the end of that summer. It came in the form of a letter. No envelope. No return address. Just a single page, left in our mailbox, folded with the precision of a person who didn't know what else to do but try. My father's handwriting. 4 lines. "We've lost most of what we thought we built. Not just wealth. Friends. Trust. Everything feels colder now. I hope you found warmth somewhere." I didn't reply. I folded the letter and tucked it into a box with Maya's hospital bracelets, her discharge papers, and the faded receipt from the florist that delivered the daisies Evelyn ordered the day Maya came home. The last I heard, my parents had moved into a small townhouse in the outskirts of the city. No staff. No gala invites. Just the 2 of them and the silence they built with their choices. But I know they see us now. They see us in the news articles about Maya's fundraising partnership with the Children's Hospital, an idea Evelyn helped her dream up one afternoon while baking. They see us in the local paper, where Thomas and I were featured for launching a support fund for families navigating sudden medical crises. They see the photos. The joy. The soft, unshakable light in Maya's eyes. And they know. They know what they gave up. Not money. Not legacy. Family. We celebrated Maya's 6th birthday at home, with a cake shaped like a rocket ship and glittering candles that flickered like tiny stars. She wore a silver crown and made everyone take turns pretending to be her space crew. Evelyn dressed as a moon fairy. James wore a colander on his head. Thomas built a spaceship out of cardboard and duct tape, and I sat on the couch watching them all, my cheeks sore from smiling, my heart so full it barely fit inside my chest. After the last candle was blown out and the room dimmed, Maya curled into my lap and whispered, "This was the best day, Mommy." And I smiled through the tears as I kissed her forehead and whispered back, "The best is still coming." Because I believed that now. Not because we had everything we wanted, but because we had exactly what mattered. Some nights I still think about the moment it all began. That dim hospital room. That fragile hand in mine. That impossible number on a page. I remember thinking I didn't know how we'd survive it. But now I understand some storms don't come to break you. They come to clear your path. My parents refused to save my child, choosing luxury over love. Now they have nothing. And yet I have more than I ever dreamed I would. Because family isn't always about blood. It's about who stands with you when everything else falls apart. Subscribe because the people who truly love you won't just show up when it's easy. They'll stay when everything goes dark. Would you forgive parents who chose luxury over your child's life? Comment your thoughts below.